Technical and scientific translation has traditionally been the dog's body of theoretical discussions of translation. The underlying rationale when approaching this type of translation has usually been that literature involves a creative elaboration of language, requiring the translator to re-elaborate language in a similarly creative way, whereas translators of technical and scientific texts only have to deal with a type of discourse where the vocabulary, terminology, is, or at least tends to be, univocal, having ready-made equivalents, and the use of language, style, is simple and straightforward. In other words, anyone with a reasonable command of a language and a high level of technical or scientific knowledge can write a good technical or scientific text, whereas very few can write a good poem or novel, even in their mother tongue, and the same would apply to translation. Thus, literary, including Bible translation, has always been in need of serious reflection, whereas technical translating only needed good technical practitioners who knew their terminology. Classical authors in the literature on translation, like the much-quoted Schleiermacher, even deny the title of translators to those who deal with non-literary or high scholarly texts, religious and philosophical mainly, in a perfect representation of the traditional line of thought on this issue. Seven Things are, and aims to make searching as complete as possible. However, it is important not to overlook the fact that some publications will belong to two or more categories simultaneously in our analysis. In some cases, e.g., the Pear Technical Bible, 5 entries including both keywords simultaneously, or Technical Literary, 26, this will be quite rare, but other pairings may well be more productive, e.g., Technical Teaching, 307. A global overview. To start with, then, we have 1,905 publications, 9.3%, on technical translation as compared with 4,314 entries, 21%, on literary translation. This means that scholarly effort on the literary side of translation is 2.3 times higher than the discussion of technical texts. Even discussion of poetry, a distinctly minority genre, is comparable with that of technical texts, as it represents as much as 2/3 of the figures for technically oriented publications, with 1,275 entries, 6.2%. This backs up the idea mentioned above of the traditional focus of translation studies on canonicity. To quote Della Bastida, 1990-97, here, the social sciences tend to select their objects of study on the basis of cultural prestige rather than intrinsic interest. It is often thought more prestigious to study Shakespeare than to study popular literature, or, for that matter, derivative phenomena such as translations. Those who do study translations would therefore rather study translations of Shakespeare than translations of TV soap operas. And he is only speaking of literature. Indeed, there seems to be a scale as to what is traditionally worth a scholar's efforts. To begin with, we have the essentially romantic idea that it is much better to study originals than translations, even if a given author has systematically been known in a given language area through translations. In fact, even though the scholar in question can only study that author through versions in his/her mother tongue, so that the conclusions are really drawn from translations and not from the original text. Translation is then a secondary, derivative, and invisible activity, and technical genres, which have traditionally the study of technical and scientific translation. 8 had very little cultural prestige as a matter of language and style, are even less interesting if they have to be studied as translations. But that is only the old-fashioned view. Or is it? Let us take a look at the evolution of those 1,905 publications on technical translation as compared with the rest. I will divide time here into two great periods, before 1950, before 1900 and 1901 to 1950, and then continue to analyze publications by decades until the year 2000. The reason for doing this is mere availability. Between, so to say, the beginning of time and 1900, we have 259 entries, always as collected in Bitra up to September 2003, dealing with translation, whereas in 1901 to 1950 we have 340. It would make very little sense and only bring in bias to divide any of these two periods by decades. After the Second World War, things changed completely for translation studies, and in 1951 to 1960, we have 596 entries,